He mocked her on stage to get a laugh from the crowd. But what she did next didn't just silence the room, it reminded every man in there what real dignity looks like. You won't believe who ended up clapping the hardest. It was the kind of night that tried to look elegant on the outside, but couldn't hide the friction underneath. A black-tie charity gala held in one of Boston's oldest ballrooms, the walls lined with oil paintings and gilt-framed mirrors, the chandeliers dripping light like it was still the 1920s. The theme was harmony and community, a name that felt ironic once you stepped into the room and caught the sideways glances, the half-smiles loaded with judgment, and the careful conversations where words were chosen like chess pieces. The city's elite had turned out in full force, artists with long scarves and louder opinions, politicians shaking hands with donors they couldn't stand, influencers taking selfies next to causes they barely understood. It was a space where social clout mattered more than sincerity, where appearances danced just ahead of truth. And right in the middle of it stood Karoline Leavitt, young, firm in her beliefs, dressed in a navy gown that wasn't flashy but commanded attention nonetheless. She didn't hide who she was, a conservative voice in a room that preferred its speeches progressive and its applause unanimous. For many guests, her presence was seen as a provocation, like a wrinkle in an otherwise curated evening. But she wasn't there to argue or grandstand. She came alone, without handlers, without press. She came to show something more rare than opinion: grace under pressure. Karoline moved through the room with a calm, almost disarming smile, offering greetings that were sometimes returned and sometimes not. A few whispered behind cocktail glasses. Others eyed her like she didn't belong. And yet, she stayed, not because she needed approval, but because she understood that real change never comes from echo chambers. It comes from showing up, again and again, with quiet strength. It was an odd kind of battlefield. Soft music, expensive wine, and people dressed to impress, but to her it was just another front in the long war for dignity, for truth, and for the right to be heard without being hated. But not everyone in that room believed she had the right to be there at all, especially not the host of the evening, Theo Lancaster, a jazz pianist with silver hair, thick-framed glasses, and a reputation for turning every event into a subtle political stage. Theo was beloved in these circles. His music, undeniably brilliant, had scored multiple documentaries and earned him praise from NPR and the New York Times. But he was also a loud critic of everything Karoline stood for. He'd called her a mouthpiece for regression in a podcast, interview just months before. So when Theo spotted her from the stage as he tuned his piano, a flicker of something sharp crossed his face. The room quieted as the lights dimmed, and Theo leaned into the microphone with the kind of practiced casualness that always meant something was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we gather tonight to support unity and inclusion, and it seems we've included just about everyone, musicians, activists, and even a few politicians from the other side of the piano bench." The crowd chuckled, some uncomfortably, others all too eagerly. Karoline felt the heat of dozens of eyes land on her at once, but she didn't flinch. She didn't laugh either. She simply nodded slightly, eyes steady, as if to say, "Go ahead, I've heard worse." Theo smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "Maybe before the night's over, our guest might even honor us with a song. I mean, how else can we find common ground if not through music, right?" More laughter. A few people clapped, unsure if it was a joke or a dare. Theo turned back to his piano and began to play, but the seed had been planted. And while most in the room saw it as a harmless jab, Karoline knew exactly what it was: a setup. He wanted to make her look small, to turn her presence into a punchline. She sat still, expression unchanged, but something stirred quietly inside her. Because she wasn't just a politician. Long before the campaign trails and interviews, before the debates and headlines, Karoline Leavitt was a musician too. Her mother had taught her piano when she was 6. She'd spent long New Hampshire winters tucked inside her family's modest home, learning to play not for performance but for peace. Music had been her first language of truth, before politics, before pressure. And now, on a night designed to shame her with elegance, that truth was rising in her chest like a storm. If you're watching this, and you believe that dignity still matters in this world, that showing up with humility and strength speaks louder than any insult ever could, then I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Because the stories we tell here are not about clicks or outrage. They're about real people standing in the fire with their heads held high. If you're tired of the shouting and hungry for something real, then this is where you belong. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't political. It wasn't a stunt. It was the quiet, powerful answer to a room that thought it had her figured out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for permission. She simply rose from her chair, walked toward the stage with a calmness that was almost eerie. And, with every step, the room grew quieter, until all you could hear was the soft echo of her heels on polished marble and the faint, nervous chuckle from Theo as he tried to make light of it. "Oh," he said, half laughing, "we're doing this." Karoline nodded once. No words, just truth. She sat at the piano bench, adjusted her dress modestly, placed her hands on the keys, and played the first note. And in that single moment, every smug laugh, every whispered comment, every false assumption died. Theo was the final act of the night, and he knew it. He took the stage with the ease of a man used to admiration, his black blazer catching just enough of the stage light to look intentional, his fingers dancing over the piano keys as if they owned the air in the room. The crowd welcomed him with warm applause, not just because of his talent, which was undeniable, but because Theo Lancaster represented something more to this audience. He was their voice wrapped in jazz chords, their sarcasm stitched into melodies, their clever defiance given rhythm. His opening notes were smooth, laced with the kind of polished charm that makes an audience lean in. But it wasn't long before his music slowed, and his real performance began, not with notes, but with words. "You know," he said between tunes, flashing a smirk that teetered between amusement and condescension. "I heard we've got some diversity in the house tonight." The room chuckled, curious. "Apparently, we're expanding our definition of community outreach, all the way to the far right." A few scattered laughs turned into waves of polite snickering as eyes subtly shifted toward Karoline Leavitt, seated 2 rows back near a cluster of donors. She didn't look down. She didn't shift in her seat. She just watched him, expression unreadable. Theo, emboldened by the crowd, went further. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hear we have Karoline Leavitt with us tonight. A conservative politician, at a jazz benefit. Now that's what I call offbeat." The laughter this time was louder. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. It was the kind of laugh that doesn't come from joy, but from tribal reassurance. An unspoken high five shared between those who believe they're on the right side of the room. And Karoline? She didn't flinch, didn't fake a laugh. She simply gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment without giving it power. But Theo wasn't finished. He leaned on the piano, face casual, but voice edged. "Since you're here mingling with the creatives, maybe you'd like to show us you've got more than talking points. How about a little tune?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge laced in sugar. A few claps started, mock encouragement. Some thought it was harmless fun. Others knew better. No one in that ballroom expected her to say yes. After all, who says yes to public humiliation when it's handed to them wrapped in faux politeness? But then Karoline did something that turned the temperature in the room. She stood, calmly, no drama, just stood up and smoothed the skirt of her navy dress, then looked straight at Theo. "Sure," she said, just that one word. The clapping stopped. Conversation died. Glasses froze mid-air. For a heartbeat, even Theo looked surprised. "Wait," he said, blinking. "Really?" She nodded and walked toward the stage with the deliberate grace of someone who had nothing to prove, but every right to be there. What was supposed to be a punchline had just turned into a moment no one could control. Theo stood aside, trying to play it cool, but the edge of his smile tightened. Karoline stepped up to the piano with quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from someone who's walked through worse storms than this and learned to let the wind pass right through her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask what song he wanted. She simply sat down, centered herself, and placed her hands on the keys. It's hard to explain the silence that followed. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the collective realization that something unexpected was happening. Something real. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward just slightly, eyes fixed, uncertain. Even the servers had paused at the edges of the room. No one dared speak. In that moment, every smug laugh and whispered insult hung in the air like dust, suddenly weightless and absurd. Because when she played the first note, it was clear this was not a gimmick. It wasn't politics. It wasn't performance. It was truth, raw, unguarded, and undeniable. The chords were deep and haunting, fingers moving with the kind of instinct that can't be faked. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was simply telling the truth in the only language no one can twist: music. It was a classical piece, but infused with emotion that made it feel like it had been written in that very moment, just for that room. And for the first time all night, Theo Lancaster wasn't the one setting the tone. He wasn't the one holding the room. Karoline was, a conservative politician in a crowd that didn't want her there, sitting at a piano she didn't ask to play, transforming what was meant to be mockery into something noble and unforgettable. And maybe that's what hit hardest for the people watching, because she didn't fight back with anger or clever comebacks. She answered insult with beauty, condescension with poise. She didn't rise to his bait, she rose above it. And as the piece unfolded, note by aching note, even those who had laughed at her began to shift in their seats. Uncomfortable not because she was failing, but because she wasn't. Because their assumptions were unraveling. Because they'd been part of something ugly disguised as entertainment. And now they had to sit with the discomfort of seeing dignity in someone they'd decided didn't deserve it. By the time the final note faded, the room had transformed. And in that heavy, sacred silence before anyone dared clap, one truth settled in the air like dust in sunlight. He didn't mock a politician. He tried to humiliate a woman, and what he exposed wasn't her weakness, it was his own. Theo tried to mask his surprise as best he could, stepping aside with a theatrical flourish and gesturing toward the bench like a man still convinced he controlled the show. "Be my guest," he said, the words smooth but laced with disbelief, his voice clinging to a thin thread of confidence that was already beginning to fray. Karoline nodded politely, without the slightest twitch of defensiveness, and took the seat with the composure of someone far too familiar with being underestimated. The air inside the grand ballroom thickened, like a storm cloud had quietly settled overhead. People shifted in their chairs with a mix of curiosity and quiet anticipation, their smiles waiting to turn smug. Some had already prepared their internal punchlines, expecting a stiff performance or a fumbling mess of keys, confirmation that the politician from the other side didn't belong here among the artistic elite. But then, silence. Not just absence of sound, but the breathless kind that turns a crowded room into a vacuum. She sat, poised, unmoving for a beat too long, almost as if listening to the ghosts in the piano itself. Then, she placed her hands gently on the keys. One soft note, then another, emerged. Not forced, not hesitant, but clear and deliberate, ringing out like a whisper that dared to interrupt a lie. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. And then she began to play. Not a pop song, not something familiar and safe, but Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece soaked in drama and technical complexity, the kind of piece no one fakes their way through. It was bold, almost defiant. Within seconds, the energy in the room changed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Drinks stopped mid-sip. Forks hovered above plates, forgotten. Her fingers moved with a fluency that spoke of years of practice, the kind of practice that begins when most kids are still learning the alphabet, and continues through long, lonely hours that bear no applause. Her back was straight, posture graceful, but her eyes were focused only on the keys, eyes that weren't seeking approval, just speaking their truth through music. The room, once smug and self-congratulatory, was now captive. It wasn't just the mastery of the piece. It was the emotion, the clarity of it. Each phrase carved out something unspoken, something raw. It was grief and pride and defiance all at once. And more than anything, it was personal. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a confession. Every note hit with the weight of someone who had been told, again and again, that she didn't belong, that she wasn't enough, that her presence in that room was a punchline waiting to happen, and who refused, with every keystroke, to let that story go unchallenged. Theo, standing beside the piano now, watched with growing discomfort, his arms crossed, then uncrossed. He smiled, then stopped. His brow creased as he looked down at her hands, as if trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. It was no longer a joke, and he knew it. The people in the audience who had clapped in mockery now sat stone still, many leaning forward, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't deny. A few people who had laughed the loudest were now looking. At the floor, their amusement hollowed out and replaced with something closer to shame. For Theo, the unraveling was slow and public. This was his stage, his night, his room. Until suddenly it wasn't. The more she played, the more it slipped through his fingers. And it wasn't just that she was good. It was that she had turned, the very insult he'd crafted into the weapon of her redemption. She hadn't retaliated with anger. She hadn't even hesitated. She had accepted the challenge and transformed it into something beautiful, something sacred. That kind of grace is rare, and dangerous to those who thrive on ridicule. And yet, even as the room absorbed this unexpected shift, the worst hadn't come yet. As she neared the climax of the piece, her intensity rising, the sound swelling, Theo made a mistake that would cost him dearly. He tried to interrupt. Whether it was panic, ego, or sheer desperation, no one could say. But suddenly, his voice pierced the music like a shard of glass. "All right," he said loudly with a forced chuckle. That's enough. I think we get the idea." The words hit like a slap across the room. Gasps rose from the front rows, while others just stared, stunned. Karoline didn't stop. Her eyes didn't even flicker. She played on, undeterred, as if his interruption were no louder than a breeze in a storm. But the audience heard it, and they didn't like it. A few heads turned toward Theo, eyes narrowing. A man near the back whispered, "Let her finish." The tension that had once been Karoline's now belonged to him. What began as a petty joke had backfired in front of dozens of donors, media reps, and political insiders, many of whom were now watching Theo, not with admiration, but with growing disapproval. Because what he'd done wasn't clever. It wasn't witty. It was small. It was petty. And worst of all, it was desperate. It exposed something he hadn't meant to show, the fear that maybe, just maybe, she was bigger than the box he'd tried to keep her in. When the piece finally ended, it didn't end with thunder. It ended quietly, the final notes fading into the still air like the closing of a door that can't be reopened. Karoline stood. No bow, no flourish, just a nod, dignified and steady, as she turned to return to her seat. The applause began slowly, one person, then another. It wasn't loud at first. It was stunned. But it grew. Not a standing ovation, not yet, but something more meaningful. A realization. A reckoning. Theo stood alone now, awkwardly holding the mic, watching as the narrative he had tried to control dissolved right in front of him. But before anyone could process what had just happened, the evening took another sharp, unthinkable turn. From the back of the room, someone called out, not loudly, but with a sneer that sliced clean through the applause. "Guess you rehearsed. That just for the cameras, huh?" The words didn't come from Theo this time, but they struck just as deeply. Karoline turned slowly, eyes searching for the voice. And that's when it happened. A local columnist, one who'd been sipping wine and chuckling all evening, stood up and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "Still doesn't change who she is." And in that one moment, all the grace, all the beauty, all the raw vulnerability she had just poured into the room was dismissed like a party trick. It was a betrayal, not just of her talent, but of her humanity. Because no matter what she did, no matter how eloquently she played, for some in that room she would never be more than a label to mock. And the realization hit like a gut punch. Not just to her, but to everyone watching who had ever known what it felt like to give your best and have it reduced to nothing. As the final chord hung in the air, delicate and lingering like a whispered truth. The room remained suspended in a moment of reverent silence, as if every breath had been collectively held to honor the unexpected revelation that had just unfolded before their eyes. It was a silence heavy with awe, a pause pregnant with recognition, not just of skill, but of something far deeper: courage, resilience, and the quiet power of dignity reclaimed. Then, as if a dam had burst within the hearts of the crowd, thunderous applause erupted, rolling through the room like a tidal wave of genuine respect and astonishment. People rose from their seats in unison, their hands clapping not in polite gesture but with a fervor that shook the walls of that grand Boston hall. Whistles pierced the air, sharp and jubilant, mixing with the soft sniffles of a few who wiped away tears born not of sadness, but of profound connection and the healing of old wounds. Karoline, calm and composed, stood gracefully, offering a slight nod that carried the weight of countless battles fought in silence. Without a word, she returned to her seat, her dignity intact and shining brighter than ever, unshaken by the earlier jabs or the doubts cast upon her. Theo, the man who had intended to ridicule her, was left speechless, his usual confident smirk replaced by an uncertain, almost humbled expression. He stepped back up to the microphone, fingers nervously adjusting the stand, searching for words that could bridge the chasm between his earlier cynicism and the undeniable truth he had just witnessed. "Well," he said slowly, voice tinged with reluctant admiration, "remind me never to challenge a guest without doing my homework." The crowd responded with laughter, not the mocking kind, but a shared moment of warmth that spread through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. Looking toward Karoline, he added quietly, "That was incredible." In that instant, something shifted, not only in the atmosphere of the gala, but in the hearts of those present. For the rest of the evening, people approached Karoline not with suspicion or scorn, but with genuine curiosity and newfound respect. Conversations that had been icy and guarded thawed into open dialogue, bridging divides that once seemed unbridgeable. It wasn't just her politics or her presence anymore. It was the undeniable proof that beneath the surface of labels and assumptions lay a person of extraordinary talent and unshakable character. Karoline had done more than play the piano that night. She had changed the narrative, shattered expectations, and forced everyone to reckon with the truth that respect and dignity are earned not by conformity, but by authenticity and courage. And as the gala wound down, whispers began to circulate about what this moment could mean, not just for Karoline, but for the fragile and divided world outside those walls. A powerful ripple had been sent through the community, and it was clear that this evening was far from over. Something bigger was on the horizon, something that would challenge not only the politics of the night but the very way people saw each other. And as those whispers grew louder, the story was only just beginning. What began as an attempt to humiliate Karoline Leavitt in front of a crowd quickly transformed into one of the most unexpected and memorable moments of that night. A moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of that Boston gala and touch something deeper in all who witnessed it. Karoline later revealed that her journey with music started when she was just 8 years old, spending countless hours at the piano bench, training in classical pieces with the discipline and passion that only a true artist possesses. While politics became her chosen path professionally, a world often marred by division, harsh words, and relentless scrutiny, music had always been the quiet, steadfast companion of her soul, a place where she found peace and authenticity away from the public eye. It had been over a decade since she last performed publicly on a grand piano. Yet on that night, she allowed her fingers to tell a story far more eloquent than any political speech or campaign promise ever could. Her performance wasn't about proving a point or silencing critics. It was about breaking through the rigid walls of assumption and prejudice with something profoundly human, pure, authentic expression that transcends ideology and labels. The ripple effect was immediate and unexpected. A clip of her playing went viral, not because of controversy or scandal, but because it captured something rare and beautiful: grace under pressure, humility and triumph, and the kind of surprising brilliance that forces even the most stubborn minds to reconsider their judgments. In an era when society feels increasingly divided, When conversations often stop before they start because of preconceived notions and tribalism, Karoline Leavitt managed to unite a room full of strangers, not with words, which can be twisted and weaponized, but with music, a universal language that speaks directly to the heart. Her story reminds us that dignity is not about never being challenged or insulted. It's about responding with integrity and authenticity that can't be undermined. It teaches us that beneath the surface of political affiliations and public personas lie full complex human beings with talents, struggles, and dreams that don't always fit the boxes we try to put them in. For men who've seen the world change, who understand the value of respect and the quiet strength it takes to hold on to your truth in difficult times, this moment offers something deeply hopeful: that we can rise above division and rediscover the shared humanity that connects us all. The takeaway is simple but powerful. Sometimes the most profound victories come not from shouting louder, but from letting our true selves shine quietly and letting that light speak for us in ways words never could. If there's one thing we can take away from Karoline's story, it's this: true strength lies in staying true to yourself, even when the world tries to define you otherwise. Respect and dignity aren't given. They're earned through courage, grace, and authenticity. If you believe in stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of rising above division, make sure to subscribe and join this community where real, meaningful conversations happen. There's much more ahead that will inspire, challenge, and remind us all why standing tall matters. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and stay connected.